My name is Eleanor. I'm 34, and this story isn't about success. It's about the cost of it. The moment I realized I had truly lost my family wasn't during the lonely 90-hour work weeks or the holidays I missed. It was on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in my Austin condo, the day after the ink dried on the sale of my medical technology company for $50 million. Instead of celebration, my father, Arthur, slid a leather-bound folder across the table. On its cover, in a cold corporate font, were 4 words that stopped my heart. Family Equity Distribution Proposal. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an invoice for my entire life. They had calculated, down to the last cent, how my sacrifice, my risk, and my mind belonged to them. It was a quiet, clinical execution of a relationship, and the silence in the room was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. They weren't just asking for a piece of the pie. They were claiming they owned the recipe, the oven, and every ingredient I had bled for. If you have ever poured your soul into something, only to watch someone else feel entitled to the rewards, just hit that like button to acknowledge that feeling. Before I walk you through the 10 pages that detailed how they would liquidate my future for my brother-in-law's failing ambitions, we have to go back. Back to a small town in Ohio, where the seeds of this entitlement were sown in what I mistakenly believed was the fertile ground of family love. That ground in Ohio wasn't fertile. It was conditional. On the surface, we were a picture-perfect Midwest family. My father, Arthur, was a stern insurance adjuster, and my mother, Carol, a substitute teacher whose heart always bled for the perceived underdog. The problem was, in their eyes, I was never the underdog. When I excelled in the state math Olympiad, it was simply what Eleanor does. But when my younger sister, Sophie, managed to pass a class with a C-, it was cause for a celebratory dinner. The disparity was a quiet hum beneath our daily lives, but it became a formal, structured injustice in college. I earned a full academic scholarship to Ohio State for engineering and worked 20 hours a week at the campus data center to cover my books and rent. My parents, Arthur and Carol, saw this not as my hard-won independence, but as a family surplus. During Thanksgiving of my freshman year, they pitched their brilliant idea, the Sophie Support Fund. Since my education was, in their words, free, they argued that the money I earned from my job should be used to help my sister blossom at her expensive private liberal arts college. Her blossoming required funds for sorority dues, a spring break trip to Cancun, and what they termed vital social networking experiences. They framed it as a noble, collective family venture. I was the silent partner whose only role was to provide the capital. I know it's getting late for many of you watching this right now, but if you've ever felt like you were working on a different clock than everyone else, just do me a favor and comment with the current time on your screen. It was the beginning of my life's work being treated as a communal resource, a fund they could draw from at will. I knew that to build anything for myself, I couldn't remain a communal resource. So, after graduation, I packed my 10-year-old sedan with everything I owned and drove the 200 miles south to Austin, Texas. The city was a hotbed of innovation, but I wasn't chasing another social media app. I had a mission, an obsession born from watching a beloved professor lose his life to a disease diagnosed too late. I was going to build an AI-powered diagnostic platform. My software would analyze complex medical data to detect rare genetic disorders years before the first physical symptoms appeared. This wasn't about a successful exit. It was about giving people back their lives. My first years in Austin were a brutal montage of instant ramen, 18-hour days in a sweltering garage space, and the gnawing fear of failure. I poured my life savings into servers and data sets. Then, one night, at 3 a.m., after a solid month of debugging, the algorithm fired perfectly. It correctly identified a specific protein misfold in a blind dataset, a result that could have saved a real person a decade of pain and uncertainty. My hands were shaking. I called home the next day, my voice cracking with emotion, trying to articulate the gravity of the breakthrough. After I finished, there was a brief pause. Then my mother, Carol, said, "Oh, that's just wonderful, honey. Listen, speaking of solving problems, your sisters Sophie and Blake are expecting, and they're just beside themselves worrying about affording the right kind of car seat. The safest one is nearly $400. My life's work, a tool that could quite literally save lives, was immediately demoted, overshadowed by a $400 consumer product. In that moment, I realized my passion was irrelevant to them. Only my potential utility mattered. That car seat conversation was a turning point. I stopped sharing my victories. I sent the obligatory checks for birthdays and holidays, kept the phone calls brief, and poured every remaining ounce of myself into my work. Fast forward 5 years, my company, Evum Diagnostics, was no longer in a garage. We had a real office in East Austin, a team of 12 brilliant minds, and we just closed our first round of seed funding. My success, even on this modest scale, was like a dinner bell ringing 200 miles away in Ohio. My sister Sophie and her husband Blake decided they were done with apartment living. They had their hearts set on a house in Westlake Hills, a neighborhood with a median home price well over $1 million. Their reasoning was the excellent school district, despite their first child being only 2 years old. Blake was a musician who was perpetually on the verge of making it, and Sophie worked part-time at a high-end boutique. Of course, the bank took one look at their finances and practically laughed them out of the office. So my father, Arthur, called me with a plan. He didn't ask me for a down payment. His request was far more insidious. He wanted me to co-sign their mortgage. "Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with that familiar tone of unquestionable authority, "this is for my grandchildren, so they can have a yard to play in. Your signature on a piece of paper is a small thing to ask." A small thing. A 30-year, 7-figure legal and financial liability was a small thing. He was asking me to personally guarantee their dream on the back of my own financial future. I want you to be honest in the comments. Type 1, if you would have shut it down immediately, or type 2, if you would have felt the pressure from your family to consider it. I was being asked to gamble everything I had built not on a calculated risk for my business, but on their proven track record of irresponsibility. I said no. It was one of the hardest words I had ever uttered to my father, a clean, simple word that felt like a declaration of war. I explained, calmly and logically, the catastrophic risk it would place on my company's finances and my own. To prove I wasn't the heartless monster he was implying I was, I made a counteroffer. I would give them a one-time gift of $25,000 for a down payment on a house they could realistically afford. It was a generous sum, enough for a wonderful home in a less extravagant Austin suburb. Arthur was eerily silent on the phone, a silence I foolishly misinterpreted as reluctant understanding. I was wrong. 2 months later, I flew back to Ohio for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration. The backyard was filled with dozens of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years. I felt a current of strange energy in the air, a mix of whispers and sideways glances. But I pushed it aside, determined to celebrate my parents. After the cake was cut, my father stood up, clinking his champagne flute for a toast. He spoke of legacy, of family sticking together. Then, he locked his eyes on me from across the lawn, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "And I want to make a special announcement," he boomed, his voice silencing the chatter. "I want everyone to join me in thanking my daughter, Eleanor. Her incredible success has enabled her to do the right thing by her family. She is buying her sister and Blake their dream home." The yard erupted in applause. Aunts were crying. Uncles were patting me on the back. I was frozen in my chair, a polite smile plastered on my face while my blood ran cold. He had taken my refusal and my compromise and twisted them into a public proclamation, a social contract I had never agreed to. It was a checkmate, designed to make me the villain if I dared to reveal the truth. The humiliation at that party was the final crack in the dam. I stopped flying home. I focused on my work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. In the 3 years that followed, Avum Diagnostics became my entire world. We perfected the platform, secured contracts with 3 major hospital networks, and then the offer came. The $50 million acquisition from a global healthcare giant. The news was public, reported in every major tech journal. There was no hiding the number. And that number, that staggering figure, was what finally summoned me home for what my father called, with chilling formality, a family financial summit. I sat at the same oak dining table where I'd once struggled with my calculus homework. My father, my mother, Sophie, and Blake were all there, arranged like a corporate board. I was not their daughter. I was an asset to be liquidated. Arthur slid the leather-bound proposal across the table. It was 10 pages long, complete with spreadsheets. The first items were horrifyingly predictable. I was to pay off my parents' mortgage, clear Sophie and Blake's 6-figure credit card debt, and purchase the Westlake Hills house for them in cash. Then came the family stipend, an annual, indefinite salary of $200,000 for my sister and her husband, so Blake could pursue his music without the burden of a day job. But it was the final page, titled Intellectual Property Legacy, that shattered what little remained of my heart. It stipulated that I transfer ownership of my core diagnostic patents, my soul, written in code, to a new LLC to be managed by Blake. He had a vision for a celebrity wellness app. They wanted to take my life's work, a tool designed to predict fatal diseases and use it to tell influencers what vitamins to take. They weren't just demanding my wealth. They were demanding the right to desecrate my purpose. I didn't scream. I didn't even raise my voice. A strange and sudden calm, as cold and clear as ice, washed over me. I looked down at their spreadsheets, at their meticulous plans for my future, and I slid the leather folder back to the center of the table. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Blake, my brother-in-law, was the first to break the silence, scoffing about how he should have known I'd be this selfish. Sophie's eyes immediately filled with performative tears. My mother, Carol, reached for her heart. "Eleanor, think of your father's health," she whispered. "The stress. It's not good for his blood pressure." But it was Arthur who delivered the sermon. He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. "Do not mistake this for a negotiation," he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "We provided the foundation for your success. We are shareholders in your life. You have a moral and financial duty to honor this proposal. It is the bare minimum of what you owe us for the privilege of your upbringing." He was framing my existence as a debt that could only be repaid by handing him the keys to my soul. "So, you have a choice," he concluded, leaning over the table. "You are either a daughter who understands her obligation, or you walk out that door, and you are nothing to us. You are with this family, or you are against it. I need you to tell me what you would have done. Comment with a 1 if you would have walked out that door right then, or a 2 if you would have tried one last time to reason with them." Looking at their hard, expectant faces, I finally saw the truth. The family I had spent my life trying to make proud had never really existed. I didn't give them an answer. The choice was already made. I stood up from the dining table, my chair making no sound on the rug, walked to the front door, and didn't look back. I half expected a storm of angry phone calls and texts on the flight back to Austin. What I got was far worse. Their response wasn't born of grief. It was a calculated, scorched earth strategy. Within a week, the smear campaign began. Sophie and Blake became masters of the vague, passive-aggressive social media post. They shared tearful stories on Instagram about the pain of being forgotten by relatives who had suddenly acquired life-changing wealth and forgotten where they came from. They never used my name, but in our small Ohio hometown, they didn't have to. Meanwhile, my mother, Carol, worked the phones, painting a masterful portrait of me as a cold, greedy monster. She told everyone how my refusal to help was putting my father's health at risk, how I was leaving my sister's children to struggle while I lived in luxury. The fallout was swift. I started getting long, sanctimonious emails from aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, lecturing me on family duty. Cousins I barely knew suddenly found me on LinkedIn, pitching me their can't-miss business ideas. My family hadn't just disowned me, they had actively poisoned the well of my entire history. They mobilized my past against me, turning the community that raised me into an army of strangers who felt they had a right to my life and my wallet. The isolation was no longer just emotional, it was a coordinated siege. I was an island, and the water was rising. For weeks, I let their siege work. I barely slept, scrolling through the forwarded emails and the screenshots of their posts. I was drowning in the narrative they had created for me, the villain in a story I never wanted to be a part of. Then one morning, looking at my own exhausted reflection, a switch flipped. Their goal wasn't just to get my money anymore. Their goal was to make me feel so isolated and worthless that I would come crawling back, ready to sign their proposal just to make the pain stop. That realization was the first spark in the dark. It was the moment I decided to stop being a character in their story and start being the author of my own. My first action was finding a therapist who specialized in family systems and sudden wealth. In our first session, as I laid out the whole sordid history, she gave me something more valuable than sympathy. She gave me a vocabulary for my pain. She called it toxic financial enmeshment. She explained their smear campaign was a classic extinction burst. The desperate, amplified lashing out that occurs when a manipulative system feels its control slipping away, and naming it took away its power. Armed with this new understanding, I began the painful but necessary work of building boundaries. I changed my phone number. I set up complex email filters that automatically archived any message from my extended family into a folder I would never open. I deactivated all of my personal social media accounts. I built a fortress of silence. Have you ever had to make a clean break like that for your own mental health? If you have, just share one word in the comments that describes the feeling it gave you. For me, that one word was oxygen. It felt like after a lifetime of being held underwater, I could finally, truly breathe. In the silence that followed that digital amputation, something unexpected began to grow. For my entire life, the word family had been a cage, its bars forged from guilt, obligation, and a shared history I didn't realize was a weapon. Now, with that cage dismantled, I had an empty space to fill, and this time I decided to fill it with intention. I started by reaching out to my old roommate from Ohio State, a woman who had seen me live on nothing but cheap coffee and sheer ambition. When I told her what happened, she didn't ask a single question about the money. She just asked how my heart was doing. I had lunch with my first real mentor, a tough-as-nails VP who had championed me in my early career. She listened to the whole saga, took a long sip of her iced tea, and said, "Good. You finally realized your spine is more valuable than their feelings." These were the first bricks of my new foundation. Then, at a fundraising event for a local dog rescue, I met Ben. He was an architect, and when he asked what I did, I simply said I was between projects. For our first month of dating, he knew nothing about the acquisition. He was fascinated by my ideas about technology ethics, my terrible taste in old sci-fi movies, and the ridiculous snort I make when I laugh too hard. When I finally told him everything, he wasn't impressed by the $50 million. He was impressed that I had survived my family. One evening, watching him play with the rescue dog I had just adopted, a simple, profound truth washed over me. This was family. It wasn't defined by blood. It was a mosaic of chosen connections, built on mutual respect and unconditional support. It was quiet, it was subtle, and it was genuinely mine. With my life finally on solid ground, the question of the money returned. It was no longer a source of pain, but a tool waiting for a purpose. My family had presented me with their proposal, a document designed to consolidate wealth and fund a lifestyle of comfort. I decided to write my own. Theirs was about entitlement. Mine would be about opportunity. Working with my financial team, I created the Praxis Initiative. It's a venture fund with a single, focused mission, providing seed money, resources, and mentorship to female founders in the demanding field of medical technology. I remembered all those years of being the only woman in a boardroom, of having my ideas condescended to by men who couldn't see past their own biases. I decided my real legacy wouldn't be the $50 million exit. It would be the next 20 women who get their brilliant, life-saving ideas funded without having to sacrifice their souls to do it. It was the antithesis of my family's proposal. Instead of hoarding resources for a few, it was about distributing opportunity to the many who deserved it. And quietly, without their knowledge, I did one more thing. I engaged a separate law firm to create irrevocable educational trusts for Sophie's children. The money is locked away, completely inaccessible to their parents, and designated solely for future college tuition or accredited vocational training. My boundary was never about punishing innocent children. It was about refusing to subsidize the destructive patterns of the adults. It was the responsible, quiet act of love that they, in their loud demands, could never comprehend. I was investing in the next generation's freedom, not their parents' delusions. Years passed. The Praxis Initiative helped launch 7 successful companies. Ben and I got married on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by our chosen family. Life was rich and real, built from scratch. Then, about 2 months ago, an email found its way to me. It wasn't from my family. It was from a guidance counselor at my old high school in Ohio. She said my niece, now a sophomore, had asked her for my contact information. Attached was a scanned, handwritten letter. It was from my oldest niece, Sophie's daughter. She wrote that she had learned about the educational trust I'd set up when she started applying for college prep programs. "My mom and dad don't really talk about you," she wrote in a careful, looping script. "But my counselor explained what you did, and I wanted to say thank you. I want to be a biomedical engineer, just like you were." It was a message sent across a decade of silence, a small crack of light suggesting that a legacy of respect might just outlast one of entitlement. That letter affirmed the brutal lessons this journey has taught me. First, true family is defined by their actions, not their blood relation. It is measured in respect, not obligation. Second, your value is not determined by your utility to others. You are not a solution to their problems or a bank for their dreams. And finally, setting a boundary to protect your peace is not an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is the price you must sometimes pay for your freedom. If this story or these lessons resonated with the journey you are on, then please hit that subscribe button and join this community. We can continue to share these stories and prove that choosing yourself is the most powerful choice of all. Thank you for listening to my story.